In my last video, I ranked every normal enemy in Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, and as I expected, a lot of people wanted to see how I'd rank the bosses in the game as well. I intentionally split up regular enemies and bosses because I think that bosses like Crump or Dupless or Grotus or whatever deserve a little bit more attention than Koopa Troopa. The boss fights in this game are one of my very favorite aspects about it and have been since I was a little kid. As with any JRPG, the boss fights are climaxes within the game where the story and gameplay come to a head at the same time, and it's glorious. Just like with the enemies tier list I did, the bosses won't be ranked purely based on strength because that's not the only thing that makes them fun and memorable. The characters that they are, the integration into the story, and the stakes they impose are all important factors and make a boss fight a standout moment in a video game, so all of those things will be factored in. It's really not a hard concept to grasp, so I don't think I need to over-explain how the ranking will work. I also do want to clarify that I'm including mini-bosses in this list as they definitely still stand out from regular enemies in the story and in gameplay. So that means that fights like Gus, the Iron Clefs, Rockhawk, etc. will be on the list. I'm also including a couple refights as distinct entries on the list because they're separated by a huge chunk of the game. The first Bowser fight in Glitzville and the second in Chapter 8 will be two separate entries, both Shadow fights will be separate entries, but I'm not going to split up both the Dupless fights in Chapter 4 since they're essentially a big fight that's split up by a chapter. And finally, yes, I will include the two extra bosses added in the remake. The only other thing I have to add before starting this list is a good old reminder for you guys to subscribe. I try not to throw these at the start of every video because it's repetitive, but it really does help me out a lot when you guys subscribe because it helps grow the channel and lets me keep doing all of this, so if you've been enjoying my content lately, then please make sure to subscribe. Now, it's ranking time. The bottom few spots of this list are probably about what you would expect, so I won't waste too much time talking about them. Darkbones is an okay fight, although it's fairly easy since it's basically 5 normal enemies, but one of them has a little bit more health than the rest. The most that it has going for it is that it's a callback to Chapter 1, and that's pretty neat, I guess. Otherwise, he's just a way to ease you into the absolute peak that happens later in Chapter 8, and I think he serves that purpose well enough. Darkbones being on the bottom slot really says a lot about the quality of this game and especially its boss roster. If the very bottom of this list is a pretty okay fight, then it can only get better from here. A staple of ranking videos for literally anything in video games is that early game content tends to get ranked lower than late game content. Maybe it has something to do with the time invested, but honestly it does make sense since anything content is supposed to keep escalating and building on top of itself. So yeah, Gold Fuzzy. He's the first mini-boss in Chapter 1, and he is a fuzzy, but gold. The part where the Fuzzy Horde attacks you is pretty memorable, but they're actually not much of a threat, so this fight still leans towards tutorial in my opinion. Gold Fuzzy and honestly the entire Schwank Fortress as a fuzzy stronghold are underdeveloped, but I can see why the developers wanted to not spend too much time on this minor dungeon. And honestly, my main problem with the Gold Fuzzy is that he feels even weaker than the next boss on this list. Blooper is another early game fight that's memorable, but pretty easy and underwhelming once you've played the game for more than an hour. All you have to do is spam Fire Flowers and the Blooper dies without ever attacking you. If you don't use Fire Flowers, then this fight is a little bit more interesting, but still nothing to write home about. Knocking him down off the ceiling eats like 3 of his turns, which pretty much seals his fate, but this fight ranks higher than Gold Fuzzy for the overall stage presence. And when I say stage presence, I mean like literally this thing's presence on stage. It's massive. It's a fun introduction to the potential for boss fights in this game, but of course it's in the prologue, so it's not very spicy. I promise you guys, we're almost out of early game hell. Redbones has a little bit more presence than Darkbones since Darkbones just rides the coattails of Redbones. It's a pretty significant moment on your first playthrough when you walk up to this Redbones pile, interact with it, and then boom, there's like 500 guys all surrounding you. This huge crowd of Dullbones of course aren't actual enemies you have to fight, and all you have to do is just hammer them away, but it's still effective in giving the player a brief sense of dread. The fight itself is pretty much on par with other normal Chapter 1 enemies. I don't think Redbones is significantly stronger than even a Paratroopa, and his Dullbones allies certainly don't pose a threat either, but it's a cool cutscene, I guess. Gus is a fantastic example of a fight that works as a set piece but is pretty mid as an actual battle. He contributes pretty strongly to the aesthetic of Rogueport in the early game, being a member of a gang that operates a toll road. The world building in this game as a whole is pretty iconic, and Gus definitely has a part to play in all of that. He has some fun dialogue and is fun to challenge during the prologue, but if you fight him anytime after that, then he's pretty much a joke. He's kind of eclipsed by the fact that you fight a completely superior version of him as a regular fight in the Glitz Pit, but the Dark Craw completely lacks any world building contributions like the original guy has. Okay, we're finally done with the early game slander session, and now we have the Bowser fight in Chapter 3. This fight is carried by shock factor and by the fact that Bowser has never had an unenjoyable appearance in any of the Paper Mario games, or at least the good ones. Other than that though, it's pretty underwhelming. Bowser's stats are pretty low, with him having less damage potential than the last few Glitz Pit fights that you do before him. His moveset is an interesting interpretation of Bowser, but it hardly matters when he hits you for almost half as much damage as he really should be able to do. And my main complaint about this fight is that it makes absolutely no sense in the story. During all the Bowser intermissions, we see that he's constantly a step behind Mario, visiting all of the locations Mario did in the previous chapter. Yet for some reason, he appears here in Glitzville, and then he still later returns to Glitzville after Mario clears Twilight Town. Like, why does he go to Glitzville, find Mario, and then still go back later assuming that he's gonna find anything useful? And then a fun Easter egg with the Bowser fight is that you can actually either win or lose to him, and the game will still progress the exact same with only a minor cutscene difference after. If you win, obviously Bowser is knocked out and that's that, but if you lose, then Bowser exclaims how good he feels and then he just leaves? Like this is everything he's ever wanted and then he sort of wins and just dips? It makes no sense. Atomic Boo is one of 3 bosses in the original Thousand Year Door that is not required to encounter in order to finish the main story, and it's honestly a pretty solid fight. His attacks are strong, hard to superguard, and can inflict the most overpowered status in the game. If he time stops you, it's pretty much GG's unless you have a ton of health to spare. His health is slightly underwhelming, but other than that, he's definitely stronger than Dupless, who's the boss of the chapter that you find Atomic Boo in. The fact that he's a hidden boss both helps and hurts his standings in my opinion. I think the way that you discover him by super hammering the boos that latch onto Mario is a really fun idea that rewards the player's intrusive thoughts. The fact that he's hidden though makes it easy enough to ignore since the reward you get from him is also pretty trash. On paper, Lucky Start is a super interesting badge, but in practice it barely does anything to actually make you stronger and just sucks up 4 of your badge points. Given the fact that this is a pretty easy game overall, stage presence is very important to how much I like a boss fight, and unfortunately Atomic Boo doesn't have too much of that going on. This boss takes things in a complete opposite direction to Atomic Boo, having incredible stage presence but being stupidly weak if you do the fight the intended way. The way that Hooktail is built up throughout Chapter 1 will always be super strong to me. First, you see Hooktail flying overhead into the castle in the background, and Goombella is like, damn, what the f***, bro? And then you head into Petal Meadows and hear multiple people talking about the plague on their village that Hooktail is. You start to understand that the Crystal Star is in Hooktail's castle, and at that point it dawns on you. I have to fight that? I absolutely love the fact that the first full-on chapter in the game pits you against a dragon 100 times the size of Mario. The blooper in the prologue introduces you to the idea that some of your enemies might be a little bit large, and then Hooktail literally does not get fully shown on screen because she's so massive. And speaking of massive, there's also an elephant in the room for us to talk about. Hooktail has a glaring weakness that the game desperately wants you to find. The letter from Colorado's dad mentions it, Miss Mouse mentions it, and it's literally placed in such an obvious spot with an obvious hint at how to get it. You have to be like 4 years old to not understand this hint, which I say because that was me. I beat Hooktail for the first time when I was a kid by spamming fire flowers and mushrooms because I didn't realize that she had a weakness. And if I can do that as a child that just barely learned how to read, then a person closer to the target demographic of this game can absolutely roll Hooktail if they use the sound effect badge. Once you hit her with it a couple times, her attack drops to just 1 and her defense drops to 0, and you win. I understand that this is the beginning of the game, but I feel like the first chapter boss should be at least a little bit stronger. Once again though, to add to her presence is the insanely iconic trick scene. First she offers Mario an insanely rare badge, which is tempting, but I mean, we gotta get this crystal star. Ooh, 1,000 coins though? That's a whole rack. No, eyes on the prize. Care to take a whiff of the rich yet delicate scent of my world-renowned feet? Oh my. The absolute best part about this whole thing is that in the remake, Koopley gets an added line of dialogue where he states, "Just before my finishing blow, she used the smell of her feet to stun me and then gobbled me down whole." So that means that he said no to the badge, he said no to the money, but when she offered up the feet, he's like, yeah, just a little sniff, I guess. 10 out of 10 video game. Unfortunately, this is probably going to become a recurring theme on this list, but here's another boss that has insanely iconic and memorable moments while being fairly underwhelming to fight. The Three Shadows are such an important part of Thousand Year Door that I don't think it would be the same game without them. Vivian is a huge emotional chord that develops throughout the game, Beldam is consistently threatening and plays an important role in the game's climax, and Marilyn says "guh" a lot. Their introduction is all over the place in terms of not showing them to be the most competent team, but if anything, it's a compelling setup for them to be held back by their own insecurities and personal arguments. If Beldam wasn't such a crazy bitch that hated her sisters and controlled them through fear and older sister supremacy, they might have been able to take Mario down and actually win. The way they behave in battle matches their dynamic fairly well, not being the most unified team, but still slightly working together and buffing each other occasionally. Their stats are pretty low, and the fact that you unlock Earth Tremor before this fight makes them pretty easy to completely destroy. The standout to this entire fight is that you are up against somebody who later joins you as a partner, which is pretty badass. Vivian wasn't the first partner in this series to work this way, with Lackluster from the original game technically doing it first, but Vivian's arc is much more impactful and emotional than Lackluster, who kind of just joins you because, I mean, what else am I gonna do, why not? And as you all know, this isn't the only time in the game you face the Three Shadows, so we'll be hearing more from them in a bit. Oh shit guys, we need a boss for chapter 2 and we have Crump here, but it would be boring if it was the same guy from the prologue.
Anybody got any ideas?
It's perfect. This boss is literally just a takeout box with arms and legs, and Lord Crump is inside of it. I totally agree with Goombella's tattle on this guy. I can't tell if it's the hardest design in all of fiction or literally the worst design I've ever experienced in my life. And that philosophical question alone helps him rank decently on this list. Lord Crump is equally iconic as the Three Shadows, and his stand as Magnus von Grapple definitely contributes to that. He kinda reads as a guy that just way hyperfixated into evil nerd villain stuff, and now that's just kind of who he is. He's like Syndrome from The Incredibles if he was half as smart and had no objectives or ambitions of his own, so basically not Syndrome, but Syndrome. This fight has a few moving parts to it, with the standout being his rocket fists. If you don't keep them in check, they'll do an unreasonable amount of damage to you. His stomp attack is kind of silly, and his earthquake attack is super silly. I'm not sure why he can't stomp on you when he doesn't have his fists, he just can't. His stats are decent for a chapter 2 boss, but it still feels like he always goes down sooner than he really should. Maybe that's just because I've played this game a million times, but I remember not struggling with him too much as a kid either. I appreciate that he doesn't have any gimmicks to him, he's just a decent fighter and he tries his very best. His presence isn't quite as high as Hooktail's, but he can actually deal any sort of damage to you, so that makes me want to rank him higher than her. This guy is one of those characters that obviously believes he's the main character, but in reality he's just some piece of shit side character that nobody cares about, and I think those types of characters are usually pretty fun. Rock Hawk plays an important role in the mystery of Chapter 3, being one of a few potential characters that could be the big villain of the Glitz Pit. The game hints pretty strongly once you get a bit into the Major League that Rock Hawk probably isn't the real villain, and then once you get to the fight with him, they pretty much tell you, oh, he's not a villain, he's just a dickhead. I love that, especially with the length of this chapter, you think Rock Hawk is going to be the chapter boss until literally the beginning of the fight with him when you realize that he's just some guy. I think that really sums up Rock Hawk's appeal. He's just some guy. and that means they can do whatever they want with him. He's written consistently entertaining and funny, and the way he's characterized through his moveset in battle is done surprisingly well. His attacks are all showmanship, dealing moderate damage at best. He has his fancy slide kick and the flip move where he even starts it by appealing to the crowd, and then he has his crazy stage rafter attack. He's a performer more than he is a fighter, but he doesn't even realize it, and that's the best part. I already touched on Lord Crump himself when talking about Magnus, but his showing in Chapter 5 is even more memorable and badass than it was in Chapter 2. For starters, we pretty much knew this fight was inevitable from the very beginning of Chapter 5, with Four Eyes tagging along on the voyage to Keelhaul Key. I'm glad the game doesn't try to really trick you at any point, because it's painfully obvious that he's Lord Crump, and they use that to build suspense as to when it will finally be revealed to Mario. And if you remember English class at all, you would remember that is dramatic irony. You've pretty much forgotten about him by the time you reach the end of Pirate's Grotto, but then, whoa, he shows up and you have a moment of, oh yeah, that guy. But then you fight Cortez and forget all about Crump again until, oh, he's got a goddamn battleship. The Battle on the Sea cutscene was already one of the standouts in the original Thousand Year Door, but they breathed so much new life into it in the remake, it's absolutely awesome. The fight itself is pretty cool, but the highlight is definitely the overall context of it. I like how he uses various different X-Naut units that increase the stakes as the fight goes on. In the second phase, his X-Naut ball attack actually does some pretty serious damage, but he doesn't really have enough health for it to be a problem for too long. It's also kind of entertaining that on his own, all he knows how to do is kind of just butt slam into you. He does that in the prologue fight, and it's still all he can do here. I know number 15 out of 26 doesn't seem very high, but honestly, I adore this fight, and everything beyond it is just even more peak. Gloomtail is a fun moment in the story, but the lack of build-up makes the shock factor have to carry a lot of weight. It works well, and it's kind of insane for him to just be chucked into the game here with no real foreshadowing, but it loses some points compared to the slow burn of Lord Crump during Chapter 5. What does help Gloomtail though is that he's quite a bit of a difficulty spike, and I feel like this game really needed to throw one of those towards the player eventually. Gloomtail's damage output is actually pretty comparable to the Shadow Queen herself, but with a lot less longevity. The breath attack inflicting poison gives it some extra damage on top if you don't manage to guard, and he has a couple spread moves that deal even more damage. His bite attack also really sticks out to me because of the fact that it's unsuper guardable. I always have to think about it and plan around for it in challenge runs, and it's honestly such a fun curveball. There's really not too much to talk about here. You get the holy sh** dark hooktail moment and a strong boss, which isn't a bad deal. And next up is another one that gets more props for gameplay than story integration, but is still a pretty memorable moment. The Smorg is introduced pretty nonchalantly with these little guys that look kind of like fuzzies in the Riverside Station. They block the bridge switch, but f*** off pretty quickly after Mario starts beating on them. Then, the next day on the train, it turns out they stowed away and have kidnapped all of the passengers. After chasing them to the roof of the train, they form together into this grotesque tentacle monster and challenge you to a fight on top of the train. There really isn't much explained in the game about what they actually are, but my assumption has always been that they're related to the Three Shadows in some way, whether they were created by magic or something else. Beldam seems to be involved with the flipping of the bridge switch, so she probably planted these little guys there to interfere. The fight itself is one of the cooler ones in the game mechanically. It's a beloved staple in JRPGs for a boss to have a weak point hidden by appendages or other armors, and it's pretty well executed here. The fact that Thunder Rages are sold in the item shop on the Access Express makes me think they wanted you to use them to make this fight easier, and they definitely do that. A Thunder Rage instantly wipes out the appendages in the first phase, and then in the second phase, it isn't terribly hard to kill the claw with single target attacks. Fun fact about this fight that I didn't know for a long time actually, you don't actually need to defeat the claw in order to damage the Smorg. The tentacles make it invincible, but the claw does not, and I believe this is true for both the remake and the original. In terms of stats and damage output, Smorg can actually do quite a bit, so it's pretty important to take it out quickly. It'll do 15 damage per turn with all three tentacles, or 20 total with the claw, which is a huge power increase compared to the previous chapter. 50 health feels like quite a bit of health to put on a boss that can hide its weak point, so maybe they wanted to balance it out by removing the invincibility during phase 2, but either way, it really isn't too much trouble to deal with by this point in the game. You know, for how many times I've fought Bonetail in Thousand Year Door, you'd think that it would be easier for me to have anything to say about her. And yes, I said her. The original Japanese release of Thousand Year Door did refer to Bonetail as feminine, which was mistranslated in the English release. The remake fixed this discrepancy in all releases, and Bonetail is now the queen that she was always meant to be. And a queen she is, boasting the largest health stat in the game while also providing comparable damage to the Shadow Queen, and in fact the same amount of damage that Gloomtail does. This fight really stands out for being a super boss posted at the very end of a huge gauntlet dungeon. The enemies you face in the 10 floors before Bonetail are pretty intense, especially if you're newer to the game, only for them to hit you with the most health any enemy in either of the first two Paper Marios has ever had. The build up to it is immense, and it does deliver by double dipping into the Hooktail callback sauce. I have a strong connection to this fight for no other reason than the fact that I've had to plan and strategize for it so many times while doing different challenge runs for the game, but I also remember taking multiple attempts to beat her for the first time after doing the entire Pit of 100 trials several times. The only problem I have with this fight is that it's kind of just Gloomtail, but like 3 times as long. Given the fact that Bonetail can heal, she pretty much has triple Gloomtail's 80 health and the exact same offensive stats. Bonetail can inflict more statuses, but that's the only combat difference besides the health. It receives major props for being a huge milestone, but obviously she's incredibly underdeveloped beyond that. And we finally get to the first of 2 bosses added in the Thousand Year Door remake. Some people may like this one better than the other one that we have yet to bring up, but for me, it's not quite as imposing. Still though, the fact that the remake added a goddamn Wacka boss fight is absolutely insane, and it absolutely kicks ass. Wacka is such an iconic character in the first 3 Paper Marios, and for Wacka to finally be able to get revenge and fight back is so gratifying. The way you fight this guy is implemented into the game in such an ass-backwards but nostalgic way. First, you have to complete the entire game, naturally. Then you have to hit Wacka 8 times in order to seemingly kill him off and prevent him from showing up again on Keelhaul Key. And then you have to complete the Pit of 100 trials. After all of these requirements are fulfilled, you'll get a mysterious email informing you that there's a new beast on the 100th floor of the pit. After fighting all the way back through the same trials, you go into the pipe, unsure of what you'll find on the 100th floor this time, and it's Wacka. It's just Wacka. But then after talking to him, he challenges you to a fight, and what the fuck, why is he strong like that? He has nearly 100 health and has insane damage potential given the fact that he can stack attacks for as many Wacka Bumps as he has. He can also spawn red Wacka Bumps, which are even more potent, dealing 25 damage or healing him for 75, which are absurdly large numbers for this game. Wacka literally has access to immortality. He can constantly feed and heal off of his own flesh and live forever, and that's terrifying. This fight honestly feels like something that a high quality mod would add, so the fact that it's official makes it all the more magical. My only problem with this fight is that his moveset itself is pretty repetitive, only chucking Wacka Bumps at you or healing, but that is a price worth paying when it gives you such a ludicrous boss with a mechanic that ties into his whole character gimmick. I didn't find this boss quite as challenging as the other boss, and it's made especially easier by the fact that you can only encounter this guy in the post game, meaning that you would be minimum level 30 by the time you got to him. Still though, this fight was a pretty sick addition to the remake. Bowser's first stand in the Glitz Pit may have been slightly underwhelming, but his final stand in the Palace of Shadow as the penultimate boss of the game is a much stronger showing. His stats are actually threatening, he gets a much better battle theme, he has Kami Koopa by his side, and he creates an extra challenge by happening right after the Grotus fight. I know I've complained about other bosses not having enough build-up, but I think the way they handled this one is just funny enough that it works. Like seriously, shoehorning Bowser into the finale of this legendary legendary game for no other reason than "it's funny LOL" is such a bold call to make, and I couldn't imagine the game without it. Another little bit of Thousand Year Door trivia for you is that Bowser canonically falls from the Gloomtail hidden treasure room in order to land down on top of Grotus. Normally you aren't able to access Gloomtail's room after completing the Riddle Tower and unlocking the final part of the Palace of Shadow, but if you use hacks on the original GameCube version, you can fly back up there and see that there's actually a giant hole in the floor that appears after the Bowser encounter. This room was probably still accessible at some point during development if they added this detail, but in the final game you can't actually see this. Anyways, back to the actual Bowser fight. Honestly, he's just a really solid opponent, and it's super cool to see Kammy Koopa finally stretch her legs. Bowser's moveset is the same as it was in the Glitz Pit, but with over twice as much attack, and Kammy Koopa is pretty much just a Magic Koopa but with 50 health. Taking out Kammy first is generally a good strategy because of the buffs she provides Bowser, but honestly, as long as you focus them one at a time, it's not too bad either way. This fight is definitely one of my favorites, but is held back a little bit by being crammed in between a couple of even more iconic boss fights. If you thought the takeout box with arms and legs is cool, then how about the exact same thing but with a giant slapped on the front of it? Once again, the design is both incredibly lame and unbelievably hard. Lord Crump's final stand is another super memorable one, and for me it's helped even more by the fact that this is probably the single biggest difficulty spike in the game. His stats are pretty insane, and he even boasts what is technically the strongest single target attack in the game. When he uses his crowd cannon move, by default it deals 3 damage per hit with a total of 10 hits. This can be increased or decreased by defense buffs, but at face value this attack does 30 damage, which is even more than a red bump from Wacka. Besides that, he's capable of dealing 6 to each of your characters every turn, and his fists do 9 damage each if he has them deployed. This fight punishes slow play styles pretty heavily, which makes it a lot of fun in my opinion. In terms of weaknesses, this fight really doesn't have a whole lot. The build up to it is pretty fun, with the player not knowing exactly who the big villain of Chapter 7 will be. Going into it, I remember expecting to fight Grotus or encounter him in some capacity, but instead they pushed off Grotus further for one final battle with Crump. Sometimes reskin fights can be lazy, but personally I think that this is a facelift that really adds an entire new threat level to Magnus von Grapple. And remember the crowd cannon attack I just mentioned that can do 30 damage? Well, the best part about this fight in my opinion is that he can use that as many times in a row as he wants to. That's such an unhinged decision for the developers to make that I can't help but respect it a little bit. Let me just start off by saying that Cortez might be the hardest design in this entire game. Like, he is seriously badass. This fight thrives on its build-up throughout all of Chapter 5, and yet it still manages to completely stick the landing by the time you get there. First, we hear the unsavory rumors about Keelhaul Key, and then our ship literally gets sunken by Cortez. While exploring the island and the grotto, we receive constant warnings from the ominous ghost pirate and know that we'll be finding him at the end of this quest. And finally, when we get there, we're greeted with this insane skeleton pirate behemoth. In terms of his fight, he has 3.5 phases pretty much and can deal some pretty serious damage throughout. The first phase is a pretty standard one with him kind of just existing and attacking, and then in the second phase he gains a weak point but can also charge up for a large attack, and then in the third phase he and his weapons become separate enemies that can all target you in one turn. Blowing the weapons away with Flurry is the key secret to making this fight easy, but if you don't, then you'll have to endure quite a few hits until he goes down. But my very favorite aspect of this fight and Cortez is that apparently he's chill like that. You beat him and it doesn't really do much to him because he's already dead, but he's totally willing to make things easier for everyone and just give up the Crystal Star. Like, honestly, this is a pretty reasonable and nice response after we specifically came in here to harass him. And then once we team up with him to defeat Lord Crump, he becomes a nautical uber. Like, seriously, this guy rules. And now we arrive at what is definitely my favorite of the 2 new bosses in the Thousand Year Door remake. Prince Mush was always so mysterious in the original game, since we know he was the Glitz Pit's original champion, but we never really knew how strong he was. I mean, how powerful could a little toad with banana hair possibly be? Well, the answer is really f***ing strong. He's actually so strong that they had to add dialogue implying that he lost to Grubba purely based on foul play, because otherwise he could absolutely roll Grubba. The way you unlock this fight is another pretty fun one that blends right into this game's 2000s swagger. Completing Jolene's Stinky Shorts trouble will trigger her to send you an email stating that Prince Mush is back in training, and then later he'll send you an email himself stating that you can challenge him in an exhibition match. This whole process is pretty nonchalant for him to be incredibly strong and unique. He has a lot of mechanics going for him that are completely new to the game, and all of it is super cool. For starters, he has different stances that he can swap between that make him immune to jump type attacks or hammer type attacks, and then in his second phase he becomes completely immune to all damage unless you super guard him, dropping his defense to 0 for a turn. It's funny to me that Goombella's Tattle says he'll fight you straight forward with no tricks when he literally uses tricks that make him invincible and fights less honorably than Rock Hawk. During the first phase of the fight, his damage output is good, but not earth-shattering. It's pretty comparable to other late-game bosses. But once a fiery fighting spirit starts burning within him, he'll start dealing like 100 damage to you every turn. I'm not exaggerating, he'll completely wipe you out unless you super guard him and take him out first. It is a little bit of a gimmick, but I respect it so much from an optional super boss. Both Waka and Prince Mush feel like really good modded content, which personally I think is high praise for bonus content in a remake of a game. Some people have argued that Waka is stronger than Mush, but personally I think Prince Mush is a bit more difficult, if for no other reason than the fact that you have to super guard him or 0 to death him to win at all. And now, coming in at number 6 is the true champion of the Glitz Pit. The one that Prince Mush could never hope to defeat. No, I'm not talking about Macho Grubba, and we already covered Rock Hawk. I am talking about the goddamn Iron Clefts, also known as the Armored Harriers. Yes, seriously, the Iron Clefts are ranked this high. You gotta hear me out on this one. Chapter 3 has so many moving parts to it, including a fascinating overarching mystery, lots of different and unique enemies, a brand new Yoshi partner who's like the coolest partner in the game, and so much more. And despite all of that, the midway point of the chapter against the Iron Clefts still stands out to me as a defining moment in this chapter and this game. Up until this point, the game is pretty clear on how you have to approach your enemies. You hit them until they die. These guys though, when you fight them for the first time, proclaim that they are invincible and nothing can damage them. Of course, all the previous enemies, including the team of literal regular Goombas, were bragging about how strong they are, so this doesn't really mean anything, right? Well, no actually, they are completely invincible. Nothing can damage them. Not any strong attacks, defense-piercing attacks, items, special moves, or anything else. Nothing. This is the game's first and only scripted loss fight, and it happens almost halfway into the game when generally JRPGs will use that trope in the beginning. I remember being a kid and being so devastated when I came up against this fight. I hadn't gone outside the Glitz Pit to unlock the Yoshi or anything because I was dead set on just grinding through the fights back to back. I tried many different methods to kill them, but nothing stuck, and I actually had to ask my older sister to ask one of her high school friends how to beat them. After a couple days, the information trickled its way back to me, and I was astounded that there was a Yoshi partner that was able to get the job done. After playing the game dozens of times, the novelty of this encounter has definitely worn off for me, but for first-time players, it's such a defining cornerstone of this whole game. And now we arrive at the top 5 boss fights in the entire game. These are the ones that would be an S tier if it was put on an actual tier list. The rest of them would probably fall somewhere between A and C, but these are properly S. And to begin this section, we have none other than Grotus himself. Perhaps more than even the final boss, Grotus has the most build-up for a fight in the entire game. From the moment you see him for the first time during the Chapter 1 Peach intermission, you know that you're going to fight this guy eventually. The real question is, when? Well, as it turns out, he's fought at pretty much the end of the game right before the true final boss. It's an interesting setup to see two characters that despise each other but have never met each other until this point. There's always that slight disconnect because Mario has never properly gotten to hate this guy to his face, but it's still a solid execution story-wise. This fight really comes to life when the curtains are drawn though, as Grotus has such an interesting and challenging fighting style. He functions like a beefed up Yux enemy, essentially, producing two Grotus Grotous X's at the end of every turn. When he has 4 of them, he's completely invincible, and beyond that, each of them adds 1 defense to him when he has less than 4. You really have to stay on top of his Grotous X supply, as not only do they provide him with crazy defense, but they can attack you on top of his regular attacks, dealing a few extra damage each. Grotous himself can deal some pretty big damage as well, with his lightning attack dealing 7 to each character, as well as him having a fire attack, an ice attack, and even a time stop spell. The time stop spell is fairly easy to guard against, but if you miss it, then you're pretty much screwed, as he'll build up his Grotous X's and unleash a ton of damage on you. The fact that he has only 50 health holds him back from being a completely top tier threat, but his defensive capabilities can make that 50 health go further than it really has any business doing. My main problem with the 3 Shadows encounter in Chapter 2 was just how easy it was, even for the early game. None of them could do that much damage, they didn't work super well as a team, and you could delete half of their health with a single Earth Tremor. Well, their encounter in Chapter 8 does not have that problem because this team is quite strong this time around. Obviously, since Vivian joined us in Chapter 4, she is replaced in the 3 Shadows by Dupless, who adds a nice layer of complexity to this fight. He can transform into your active partner or into Mario and use those attacks against you, which is a nice continuation from how he works in Chapter 4. Lore-wise, it's kind of a gray area, but I'd be willing to accept that he used the Crystal Star to steal Mario's body rather than just transform into a lookalike, because this time around he transforms but has no effect on the character he's transforming into. This is how I've always thought of it, at least. Beldam and Marilyn function like beefed up versions of themselves from Chapter 2 with endgame level attack stats and a couple more attack options. Marilyn can charge even more now, and Beldam is actually able to inflict freeze alongside her ice attacks, which she couldn't even do in the first encounter. Across the board, they have 110 health, which is a lot when you consider it spread across 3 targets. This fight also feels pretty climactic because I feel like we were all wondering when the true final fight against the 3 Shadows would be, given that we didn't actually fight them in Chapter 4 or 6 when they appeared. It's extra intense knowing that Beldam has been orchestrating much of the events of this game in order to raise the Shadow Queen back from the dead, but for her to still come short of defeating Mario. The story context is fantastic, the fight is fantastic, and I'm so glad we get to hear their battle theme one final time in this game because it's an absolute classic. You knew she'd be pretty high on the list, and you were probably expecting her to be number 1, so I'll start with my reasons for why she isn't before I talk about how amazing this final boss fight truly is. My only problem is that the Shadow Queen doesn't get any time before the end of the game to stretch her legs. She's first confirmed to exist in Peach's quiz intermission after Chapter 4, and then becomes more presently a threat towards the start of Chapter 8. She's definitely threatening and imposing, but I feel like it would have been even more meaningful if she was raised before the final moment of the game. A great example of what I mean is the Dark Star in Bowser's Inside Story. The Dark Star gets revived in the final quarter of the game, giving it time to establish itself as a threat and prove that it is not to be f***ed with. Besides that nitpick though, holy shit, this fight, man. The Shadow Queen is still executed incredibly well from a story perspective and even better from a fight perspective. This fight is exactly the right difficulty that it should be, her design is insane, the music is amazing, and I mean, it's nearly perfect in all regards. The cutscenes that happen before and after the Shadow Peach phase are an awesome retrospective on the adventure before, although they do get pretty tiring on repeat playthroughs with just how long they are. Speaking of Shadow Peach, what an incredible moment to happen at the end of this game. The final boss looks like Peach but isn't Peach, and your partner's dialogue reminds you of that in such a powerful way. The Shadow Peach part of the fight is a great way to ease into the absolute Goliath that you'll have to fight in the second phase. She has access to strong attacks, even stronger buffs, and the part where she becomes invincible at the end of the phase is a very memorable moment. The second phase is where all hell breaks loose and she becomes probably still the strongest boss in the game. Prince Mush might be slightly more difficult technically, but only because you're essentially required to superguard him. The Shadow Queen has no gimmicks or weaknesses, you have to fight her to the death death with no holds barred. You're able to take out her hands to prevent them from attacking you, but even if you manage to kill them, they will literally only lose one turn before immediately coming back. Her pool of 150 health is the second highest in the game, and if you let the fight go on long enough, she'll heal a ton using her draining attack with her hands. This fight took me a lot of tries to beat for the first time, and to this day I feel that many new players still struggle with it. It's truly one of the best final bosses in any Mario game, and yet it's only number 3 on this list. Yes, I seriously went there. I ranked Dupless from Chapter 4 higher than the goddamn final boss of the game, but I truly couldn't do it any other way. Chapter 4 is insanely iconic, and Dupless is the main driving force behind that. When you first encounter him, he's just this goofy little guy that's turning the villagers into pigs just to feel something, and the fight with him starts out incredibly underwhelming. He only does 4 damage per attack and has 40 health, which is slightly weaker than Rock Hawk that was in the previous chapter. At the end of the fight, he becomes a shadowy copy of Mario and starts using your attacks against you, but his damage doesn't go up or anything, and he's still easy to kill. But then, after the fight ends, everything changes. Suddenly, Dupless becomes Mario, takes the Crystal Star, and leaves you in the dust with all of your partners. It gives such an indescribable feeling of helplessness when you experience this for the first time. It's truly incredible. The long walk back from Creepy Steeple to Twilight Town is controversial due to how much backtracking this chapter technically has, but I think this particular section of it is super effective in making you feel alone and dejected. Eventually, you team up with Vivian and take on Dupless and all of your previous partners in a final showdown, and it's such a cool fight. Vivian starts out by leaving Mario behind after realizing that he is in fact Mario, but rejoins the fight and helps him take Dupless down. The fight still isn't that difficult, but the partners on his side can add a fair bit of damage output to his side. The fact that you fight against your own partners is so insanely cool and makes this unforgettable. I love Dupless's stupid ass dialogue, I love his creepy gasping for air face, and I love that Vivian joins Mario here. Thousand Year Door is just such a good game, man. Obviously, this is pretty cliche to say, but when it comes to ranking videos, there can only be one true top pick. And I think that no Thousand Year Door boss fight is more deserving of this than Macho Grubba himself. Macho Grubba has it all going for him. He's a super strong boss, his integration into the story is executed pretty much perfectly, and they do better than with any character at making you absolutely hate this guy and want to kill him. There is no stronger example of a single chapter villain in the entire Paper Mario series than Grubba. He starts out fairly obnoxious but seemingly pretty harmless, but as the mystery of the Glitz Pit develops, he becomes one of the key suspects that could possibly be pulling the strings from the shadows. Rock Hawk is a misdirect that they don't try too hard with, but then Jolene is a very strong misdirect. When I played this game as a kid, I was leaning towards Grubba being the villain, but I know many people thought Jolene was the villain when they first played this game because both of them have some evidence against them. I like that we learn about many of the bad things Grubba does before we even know that he was the one who did them, because it makes it all the more damning when you discover the machine blueprints in his desk. This guy drained King K and Bandy Andy. This guy has the Crystal Star. This guy has been gassing us up for so long only to plan on disappearing us. The moment that you finally get to fight him is so rewarding because the entire chapter has been hurtling towards this moment at a breakneck pace. His transformation sequence is awesome and unexpected, but it makes sense given the fact that he's too old to be threatening otherwise. Macho Grubba's design goes super hard and his battle strategy goes even harder. I love that he has a strong emphasis on buffing himself because it allows him to stand out a lot, especially at this point in the game. Starting out by immediately giving himself 2 actions per turn feels so unfair, and that really ties into his character immensely well. Everything about this guy's presence in this game is so cohesive and so enjoyable to experience on every single playthrough of this game I have ever done. Chapter 3 in this game is widely considered to be the best one, and it is in no small part thanks to Grubba. And that brings us to the end of the list. With my enemies tier list last time and the ranking this time, I have officially ranked every single battleable enemy in the game. The boss fights in this game are near and dear to my heart, so it was so much fun to finally put exactly why to paper. If you guys enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing so that you're first in line to see future videos. It helps a ton with getting my videos into the algorithm and is truly the best way to help the channel grow. And of course, special thanks to all of my channel members for supporting each and every video. If you want to join them on this list of names, as well as get early access to new videos like this one, then make sure you hit the join button on the channel page. That's all from me today. Take care.